A very warm welcome again to all of you. From me, I'm Lucas. I work for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance in Scotland. For those of you who are joining these webinars for the first time, basically the series is organized by a kind of informal group. We tend to call ourselves the Scottish Wellbeing Economy Strategy Group. So that includes people from us, We All Scotland, but also Friends of the Earth, the Scottish Trades Union Congress, People's Health Movement Scotland, and also some academics from the University of Glasgow. And the aim of this series is to really generate some energy and discussions around the concept of a wellbeing economy in Scotland and what it means for us here. So is for those of you who have just joined, it would be great if you could put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat so we get a bit of an idea. And also please note that this meeting will be recorded. So you probably get a little button that you have to press at the top. And that means if you want to keep your camera off, feel free to do that. Unless you're speaking, you're not going to be in the recording anyway. So yeah, without much further ado, the idea for today is that we got a fantastic speaker, Milena Büchs from the University of Leeds, and she will give a little presentation about some of the research she's been doing, and then that should be about 20-25 minutes. And then we have plenty of time for question and answers afterwards. And I'm very, very pleased to have Milena here today. She's a professor of sustainable welfare at the University of Leeds and one of my former colleagues from my time there. So that's very exciting. And her research specializes in sustainable welfare, eco-social policy, and just transitions. And today, what she's going to be talking to us about is really that question, how we can finance a well-being economy without growth. Because a lot of the time, for us advocates, if we try to advocate for an economy that isn't prioritizing or focused on GDP growth, that's often the first question we get back is, yeah, but how are we going to pay for things if the economy is not growing? And I think we've all seen that, especially in the debate around this budget that was just delivered in the UK for the UK government that was delivered last week, where the discussion was very much around productivity growth and the growth or lack of growth and what that means for public finances. So yeah, I'm very pleased to have Milena here today, who can share a little bit about her research that she's done in that topic. So I'm handing over to you now, Milena.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lucas. I will share my screen. Hi everyone. It's great to see you all, and it's so fascinating to see people from very different backgrounds. So I'm very much looking forward to talk to you today about how we can pay for a well-being economy. Well, that's the title I've been given, I should say. I should pre-warn you that I'm not going to say that there's any sort of magic money tree out there. But I will talk a bit about, how we can essentially organize a well-being economy and also especially welfare services without growth. So I do think there are options available. Okay, I go straight in because, just to save time, essentially. So like Lucas said, we are very familiar all with this mainstream discourse that growth is needed to fund government spending and improve people's well-being and also finance climate policies, because the argument is always that without growth, we wouldn't have sufficient tax revenues and government debt would mushroom, essentially. So this is really the kind of discourse that people like myself and other people from the wellbeing economy and post-growth movements are trying to question, essentially because we question, of course, the role of growth in the economy, because growth is seen as deficient from all sorts of perspectives: ecological, social, justice perspectives. I don't go into detail here because I'm sure you're very familiar with all of these arguments, but the main arguments are around the infeasibility to decouple environmental impacts from growth in absolute terms at the scale and speed required. There's also lots of evidence now that growth no longer significantly improves social outcomes in rich countries. And of course, growth very often contributes now to rising inequality. So we are seeing rising inequality in lots and lots of rich countries, and all the problems that are associated with that, people not being able to meet their needs and so on. Another key argument in the debate is this argument about secular stagnation. So essentially that many rich countries now already face quite low growth rates, and that this has structural reasons. It's not really sort of down to political choices necessarily, but these reasons are in technological development, aging societies, etc. And so therefore, the argument is it is really important for governments to figure out how they can finance public services without economic growth. And hence, this is why we have this discussion today. So what I will do is I will present some of the funding options for, so initially this was all about sustainable welfare, funding options for sustainable welfare that are being discussed in the post-growth, well-being economy, and so on literatures, and then assess them with several criteria, but basically or mainly today with this criterion of is this funding source growth independent? And then I will discuss some of the implications for designing well-being economies. So I should say this presentation is based on a paper that we have currently under review. And so apologies if it comes across as a bit academic, but yeah, I'm trying to make it as sort of accessible really as possible. So, oh, and by the way, if there are any questions or if you can't hear me or whatever along the way, just open your mic and say so. So which funding options are discussed in the literature? We reviewed about 90 publications on this. So the most typical ones that are being discussed are progressive income taxes. So this is not only taxes on employment, but also taxes on things like profits, capital gains, savings, and so on. Then, of course, progressive wealth taxes. So there are different options here for wealth taxes. You can tax the whole sort of net wealth that people have, or you could tax specific assets like financial assets, land and property, inheritance and gifts, business wealth, etc. And they differ slightly in terms of how independent from growth they are. So we'll come back to that in a moment. Then environmental and or consumption taxes are also discussed in the literature, especially environmental taxes. We bunch them together in this analysis because their effects on distribution are often quite similar. So examples are things like carbon taxes, excise duties, frequent flyer levies, and so on. And then VAT is a typical consumption tax, but then we also, and we have seen that in the budget as well, there can be taxes on specific products like a sugar tax, or, sometimes people discuss things like a meat tax and so on as well. Redirecting subsidies is sometimes also mentioned in the literature, which isn't strictly speaking a funding source, but it's a redirection of existing resources within the government to new purposes. So an example would be if the government is currently giving subsidies to the fossil fuel sector or other high carbon sectors, if it then redirects these subsidies to greener sectors or social sectors and things like that. And then finally, we can't really talk about this topic without mentioning modern monetary theory. So the idea that governments, when they spend, they actually create money, essentially. So yeah, the idea here is, or the argument by modern monetary theory is that governments that have sovereignty over the monetary system, that's obviously not all governments. So the EU would, for example, be not be, or EU countries would not be in that category, but the UK would be. And so governments like that don't need to tax or borrow from financial markets before they spend. That's the idea, because the act of spending creates money. It would be money that is credited to the government by the central bank. And it's important, however, to be aware that modern monetary theory in no way says that taxation or borrowing on bond markets and so on is not important. It says it is important, and it would still have a really important role. It's just that their function is not to raise revenue. Their function is to steer the economy. So, for example, taxation can deal with inflation. Taxation is, of course, really important for redistributive purposes and to influence behaviors, to set incentives and disincentives for specific types of behaviors. Okay, and then finally, that's only a smaller point, and I will not talk too much about this, but complementary currencies also pop up in the literature. So the idea that at the local level, sort of alternative currencies can be put into circulation, usually with the aim to strengthen the local economy, so to keep resources in the local economy. So what are the criteria that we use to assess these different funding sources? Again, we take them from the literature, depending on how post-growth economies, well-being economies, donut economics, and so on, or donut economies are being described, the features that they have. And this is how we developed this set of criteria. The first one is whether the funding source contributes to the growth independence of the economy and of public policies. The second is whether the funding source can support redistribution and contribute to greater social equality and justice. That's just simply because post-growth economies are economies where without intervention, inequality could rise, because it's a zero-sum economy in some ways. Hence, redistribution is really, really important. Whether the funding source contributes to need satisfaction, especially of vulnerable groups. And then, of course, really important, it should probably be first, whether it can contribute to reducing ecological harm. So in the interest of time, I will very much focus on the first one here, and we can go through the others as well in the discussion. So in the paper, we end up with this big table where we have the funding options all on the left-hand side, and then the criteria at the top. And we then color code these different options. So the more red it is, the least the funding option is aligned with this criterion. And then if it's green, that's good. So looking at the first one, yes, unfortunately, we see lots of red here. So that's maybe a bad sign, but this is what I meant by saying, there isn't a magic money tree out there. But there are other ways, I think, that are really important to discuss when we talk about how to finance a well-being economy and how to make it work well. So I go through this now a little bit in more detail. So what do we mean when we say none of these funding sources are on their own completely independent from growth? So just to clarify, because, I've sometimes had this question. So the source itself is, of course, independent from growth. It's just sort of, they can exist. Their existence is not dependent on growth, but how much revenue or resource they can raise is usually or in some way connected to economic growth. So when we look at the tax options, for example, all of these taxes are in one way or other coupled to economic growth, meaning that the revenue that they raise would change with changes in the size of the economy. So in other words, if the economy shrinks, by that we mean firstly the market economy, then that also reduces the activities that actually raise these taxes. So that is most evident for things like taxes on income, consumption, and environmental taxes. Because they are taxes on flows, i.e. market interactions, yeah? And so if we don't have growth, especially if productivity is still increasing, employment would fall, and that means that things like income taxes, also social insurance contributions and so on would fall. The link with wealth is a little bit less strongly coupled. And so this is why many people in the post-growth literature say wealth taxes are quite promising here. Interestingly, there aren't very detailed analyses available yet, I think, of different types of wealth taxes and how they relate to post-growth criteria. So just to say that basically wealth is assets, and so assets are stocks in some ways, right? So let's say a house or a piece of land or a portfolio of stocks or something like that. And yes, their size can change, certainly over time, but some of those assets change less quickly over time, and some don't even change at all. So land, for example, is a very static asset. It can't be offshored. And so land and property in particular are sort of types of assets where the tax on them could be less coupled to changes in the size of the economy. And then it's interesting to think about the design of the tax. So is the tax on the value of these assets, or is the tax on the size of these assets? So if you look at the value, then often values still change with economic growth. So for example, house prices would come down when the economy contracts, highly likely, and land prices probably as well. So in that sense, there would still be a coupling to growth. An alternative could be to tax the size, the physical size of these assets. So per square meter of land, for example, or square meter of a property. That definitely has the advantage to be less dependent on economic growth. But I don't think, or we think in this paper, that you can't, as a government, continue to tax these assets at the same rate if the economy contracts, because the cash flow to pay for these taxes also needs to come from somewhere. And so, yeah, so there are basically also long-term limits to doing that. And then other disadvantages as well, to just tax the size of an asset and not the value, because you lose the differences in value that, different pieces of land or properties have, just simply depending on where they are, how developed a piece of land is, etc. Okay, and then talking a bit about this modern monetary theory idea. So what are the constraints here? So first of all, it sounds great, right? We can just say to governments, yeah, you can just spend money into existence. And yes, that act of spending is not coupled to growth. But the problem exists, of course, that if there's too much money in the economy that isn't absorbed by economic activity, then we get inflation. And that is absolutely an issue that modern monetary theory acknowledges. It should be said that modern monetary theory, I think, isn't as such a post-growth theory or anything like that. So in fact, it's, probably certainly initially was quite keen to actually support growth. So that's always important to bear in mind. But there is now work sort of trying to combine the two and say, okay, how could we deal with inflation if that happens? Oh, and just to say that, of course, the inflation problem is particularly severe, I think, in economies that try to stay within planetary boundaries, because in economies like that, we would have regulations and resource caps and so on that constrain economic activity to exactly, do what it says on the tin to stay within planetary boundaries. And so there is less room to expand economic activity to soak up the additional money that is in the system. So taxes are important here because taxes take money out of circulation again and sort of cancel the money that governments have spent into circulation. Also, it's important to think about which kind of inflation are we worried about. We are particularly worried about inflation that is around necessities, so housing, food, energy, transport, all of these things. And so using price controls, things like rent controls, we also have already like caps on energy prices in place and so on, are important instruments to make sure that inflation in these sectors of necessity is not too severe or ideally non-existent. Things like providing universal basic services, so publicly or collectively provided services, again, in sectors that address basic needs, based on need and not the ability to pay, that makes these services affordable to people. Again, it obviously decreases prices for these necessities, and so that can also be an important way of dealing with inflation. Okay, like I said, in the interest of time, I will really just rattle or say just a sentence or so about these other criteria, because we see more variation when it comes to the redistributive effects of these different funding options. But the key point to say here is that the one to avoid is basically environmental and consumption taxes on necessities, because they have regressive distributional impacts, which means that they burden low-income households more than high-income households relative to income. So they are the problematic one. Everything else, has positive, progressive redistributive impacts. And we have a light red here with the complementary currencies, just because they are localized and so could potentially lead to increasing regional inequalities if there isn't, sort of higher level redistribution between regions. So the redistributive effects are very much mirrored in this column on need satisfaction, because any spending that has progressive distributional impacts is also likely to help low-income households to satisfy their needs better. And anything that's regressive, has the opposite effect. And then finally, when it comes to ecological harms, the good news is that all of these options have potential to reduce ecological harms. There are a bunch of conditions related to that. So, for example, the question is, are taxes on luxuries, for example, are they really effective in reducing these environmentally harmful activities or not? It depends on how responsive, let's say, rich households in particular are to increases in price. And so on. And for government spending, it really depends on, of course, what the money is being spent on. So let me come to what all of this means, because by now you might think, okay, well, that is all not very good news when it comes to the growth independence of financing options. I would still say that there are good innovative ideas out here. So, thinking about these MMT arguments of just really sort of thinking about the order of events in a different way, that government spending comes first and taxation and borrowing on bond markets and so on comes in a way second and has political objectives. I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it, in that the interaction between taxes and government spending is really important here for things like dealing with inflation, for example. So the question then is it really a problem, actually, that that none of these funding resources is, strictly speaking, independent from growth? And here we found it quite helpful to think about sort of different phases of the economy moving to a sustainable state. Because you could argue that in an economy that has the right ecological size, so we are at a sustainable state where all the wastes can be absorbed and all the non-renewable, renewable resources can be renewed. It is actually not a problem that these funding resources are dependent on changes or would change with the change in the size of the economy. So they would just say constant, and that's fine as long as the demand for spending and the demand for welfare stay the same as well. Yeah, we just have a constant. The government raises revenues and spends them on necessary things. And that in itself could actually be fine. The problem arises in the phase where the economy contracts in biophysical terms to reach this sustainable steady state, because in this phase, demand for services and welfare would highly likely at least stay the same, if not even increase a little bit, because it's a phase of rapid transition, where people have to change jobs, need new skills, etc. And big upheaval usually has lots of social implications. So we need to respond to these implications. And of course, we also have a problem in a steady state phase when demand is increasing. So, for example, due to aging societies where we need more pension and healthcare spending, or due to other reasons, including, of course, climate change impacts. So climate change impacts themselves are highly likely to increase the need for spending in the future. One more reason to act much more quickly and reduce climate change impacts as much as we can. So basically, we then come to the conclusion that much more fundamental changes to the economic system are needed to create such a sustainable basis for financing a well-being economy and sustainable welfare. And essentially, this is all about reallocating resources to sectors that help people satisfy their needs and also to reduce environmental impacts. So it is really important here to challenge this argument that we don't have enough money and that austerity is needed to, stay within our fiscal limits and so on. So basically, we are saying here, resources are available. Financial resources are absolutely available. They are just, at the moment, extremely inefficiently allocated. They are allocated to things that we don't need, and they're allocated to generate profits for, minorities in society, which then increase inequalities. So to visualize this, we have a figure like this. This is extremely simplified. So this is really just to illustrate the idea that I was just talking about the different phases. So the boxes represent sort of the resources that are needed in the economy. And the green boxes are the resources that go into need satisfaction, where we have different sectors that contribute to it. So the welfare state, the market would, of course, still play an important role as well, just much more regulated, and home and communities as well. But we have this big white space, and that is what I meant by, the misallocation of resources. So at the moment, we have lots of activities that can be termed as luxury activities, and also activities that are harmful to the environment, harmful to people's well-being, in fact, as well, and that increase inequality. And so what we need, especially in this degrowth phase, is a reallocation of resources away from these sectors to the sectors that satisfy needs. And what is also important in all of this is still, of course, to emphasize that we need to reduce the environmental impact of provisioning. By that, I mean, the more efficient we can be in environmental terms in providing people with good transport, with energy, with food, etc., housing, the better it is, because it creates more ecological space for production and consumption. Yeah, we can have more activity in this limited, ecologically limited space if we are more efficient in doing it. So hence that still needs to remain a priority. I did talk a bit about the relationship between the availability of funding and demand for spending. And so it's also important to look at the demand side here, because you can argue that at the moment we have lots of demand for spending in the system that is created by a non-functioning or misfunctioning of the system. Yeah, of the, well, bluntly saying, of the capitalist economy. So basically the fact that we have poverty, that we have homelessness, that we have a mental health crisis, and so on, they are closely related to the way in which the current economy is operating. And so, therefore, it is so important to design the economy in ways that prevents these problems in the first place, because that reduces the sort of failure demand spending that we currently see. That is not at all, just to be clear, not at all an argument against the welfare state or anything like that. You know, I'm not saying this is superfluous, even in a well-designed economy. I think we will always need welfare institutions, because the idea here is often that we pool resources and insure against risks like health risk and so on, and income over the life course, you know, things like pensions and so on. So these sort of collective institutions will always be needed, but it is important to reduce the sort of failure demand as much as possible through preventative approaches. And yeah, and essentially, I think all of this boils down to, and this is the last sentence I will say before we can go into the discussion, is to reduce to increase not-for-profit production and provisioning, because that is key, I think, in the current economy. That sort of for-profit production essentially siphons off resources from these important sectors and channels them to a minority of actors who then profits from them. So there are so many important examples here. I'm just, for example, thinking of the latest report that the New Economics Foundation did on care. If you haven't seen it, I warmly recommend it. It is a key example of how the privatization of a system, of, in this case, the care system, you know, means that loads of resources are basically going to satisfy the profits of these big private companies, instead of actually providing high quality care and paying good wages for people who work in that sector. And that is through mechanisms of, you know, selling care homes and then having care companies having to rent them back. So lots of resources go into renting these homes, or that there's so much debt-based financing in there that lots of money goes into paying interest rather than the actual care of patients. So yeah, so there are other examples I could talk about, but essentially I think it is important to think about how can we move away from the for-profit model of production and provisioning and move to a model that is much more explicitly oriented, ideally through legal means, to provide social and ecological benefits. And yeah, this is where I will leave it for now. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Milena. That was super interesting. I enjoyed that. And it's not often that you hear such a kind of in-depth and considered approach to this question, which is often quite polarizing and not really dealt with in depth. So yeah, so we still have got quite a decent amount of time left for questions. So if you have any, feel free to either put them in the chat or raise the little, there's a little, if you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a little raise hand function in Zoom that you can use to ask a question. Or you can also put on your camera and wave your hands and I will see you. And you can ask that question this way as well. So feel free to fire away.
Don't be
I
shy.
think, yeah, so there we go. Um, so we start with Roland.
Yeah, can I come in with an absolutely horrible question? As it's a little bit from left wing on this, that the threat to people who are advocating a different economic model to neoliberalism that are being made increasingly in America by Trump and others. How do we react to those in the well-being economy movement globally? And how do we protect ourselves from being targeted because we're clearly advocating an alternative?
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? I mean, and yes, it's true. People like Trump use arguments and policies, in fact, that on the surface seem to dismantle the neoliberal system to some extent. You know, the tariffs, for example, that's probably what you're thinking of. But I think if you dig deep, then of course they're not at all challenging the neoliberal model. In fact, you know, I think a lot of the policies that they advocate for are detrimental for need satisfaction and for environmental benefits and so on. So yeah, so I don't see a big problem here in sort of how can we argue against it. I think it's just really important to dismantle some of the rhetoric that people like Trump use. Because the rhetoric is very much just on the surface. What is going on in actual terms, I think, is often very, very different from the rhetoric, and that is just really important to show and to make it clear to the public that that's what's going on.
No, thanks for that reassurance that there are people working quietly with all the alternatives. I don't absolutely agree with you there. It simply is his use of this word that those who are challenging the system are actually terrorists. That's the problem here. That is pretty overwhelming for some.
Yes. And the well-being economy movement and post-growth movement and so on, I think they come from a very, very different perspective on all of this. Like I said, I think it's just really, really important to dismantle the rhetoric that is often used. Yes, it is a populist rhetoric. It's sort of, you know, talking against elites, and they pretend to be with the people on the ground, but in actual fact, that's just so not true. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We got two more questions from Daniel and Thomas. So let's go to Daniel first.
Yeah, thanks for that. Very interesting. So as I was listening, it seemed to me that modern monetary theory wasn't essential to this. So I'm wondering what is the benefit of tying so closely to this modern monetary theory, when in fact the story is about redistribution and the targets for redistribution. So rather than looking at the end at this sort of perfect model of where you want to be, in terms of the journey towards the well-being economy, identifying those targets for redistribution and making the case for them within the current sort of economic framework that we work under seems to be more important to me. So could you just elaborate a little on whether modern monetary theory is essential to everything that you outlined? And even if it's not essential, what is the benefit of attaching so closely to this theory? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really, really interesting question. It features so much in this talk, I think, and in the paper, just simply because it is being discussed in the literature a lot. So I should have made that maybe clearer. So the funding options that we discuss are very much based on what the literature discusses. So it's not necessarily a judgment on our part in terms of how important or not these options are. But the fact is that the modern monetary theory does feature a lot in this debate. So that's maybe the first thing to clarify. And I would say so it is an interesting one. Like, I think the conclusion that we come to, you know, that essentially it is still limited, modern monetary theory is still limited essentially by inflation, especially in a post-growth context. And they would very readily admit that themselves, I think. But I think one benefit of that theory is to reverse our thinking in terms of the order in which things happen. So to really emphasize, if the government wants to spend money on a particular thing, it could be the health service, or, you know, providing better public transport, or whatever it might be, or expanding the renewable energy as a system. It can do it. It can spend, and the central bank essentially credits the government, can credit the government with money. This is not how it is often done at the moment. But yeah, and that then taxation and also borrowing on bond markets and so on, they are not the primary act to create these revenues. They are there to fulfill other political goals like redistribution. So I think it helps to get away from this argument that there's just simply no money available, or not enough money available. It does then, of course, still raise all these questions about, okay, what do we do if public debt to GDP ratios increase, for example, right? From which level onwards does that get problematic and maybe creates instability and so on? How do we deal with inflation, and so on? So I think these questions are definitely still there, but I do personally find that modern monetary theory is useful for just switching people's way of thinking about this and moving away from this, we need austerity type arguments, if that makes sense. But yes, absolutely what you say, you know, the emphasis on redistribution and essentially talking about how can we design the economy in a way that economic activity that benefits well-being and ecological outcomes is incentivized from the start, and the for-profit economy just simply doesn't do that. Yeah. So that always needs to be central, absolutely.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for that. It's just it concerns me that the delay in making that argument, the delay caused by making the argument that we need to switch to modern monetary theory, actually misses a whole lot of opportunities that could be achieved just by straightforward redistribution within the current system. But thank you for your response.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
abusing my position as chair a little bit, I think there is also a link between the two, because obviously at the moment in the current system, one of the ways it exacerbates inequality is that, you know, the government pays a lot of money on interest on government bonds. So there's a direct distribution link there, which I don't think you mentioned in the presentation, but that is when you look at like the budget that came out last week, that's quite a big chunk of government spending is actually spent on. So I think, yeah, I think some of the benefits of looking at the MMT way and making these arguments is that you know, you can question some of these underlying assumptions around these kind of things. But I think it's a very good question. There has been actually, I don't know whether this was, but there has been a bit of a discussion, I think last week or the last few weeks between Richard Murphy on the MMT side and Grace Blakely on exactly that kind of question, which was quite interesting for those of you who have been following that. But yeah, Thomas, you've had your hand up for a long time, so feel free to come in now.
Yeah, apologies. I'm not actually Thomas. Thomas invited me, so it's somehow like misidentified me as Thomas. But yeah, I'm Jim. I'm from the University of Salford. Thanks, Milena. And I think you might already have kind of answered this, and this sort of leads on from Daniel's question, really. So, like, what I take from your kind of presentation is that in a sense, having kind of reviewed the literature, it sort of displaces the question, the problem, away from kind of the pure problem of financing or economics and onto politics, right? So the question is like, how and in what stage, and what are the kind of political mechanisms that one might have to enact in order to actively design an economy and kind of put constraints on markets and all the rest of it. And I suppose that made me kind of think a bit about some of the like assumptions in terms of like whether this is just within a national economy, or whether, you know, or like, are we imagining this purely in a national context? And the other kind of thing that made me kind of question, so this might be beyond the scope of your paper, but I wondered if that's how that's addressed in the literature. And I think sort of connected to that for me is the other problem, like, that people raise with MMT is not just inflation, but if you're not the issuer of the global reserve currency, you're going to run into difficulties by bond market attacks and not being able to get the resources that you need on international markets. And so there's this kind of problem, which is the problem of essentially a national economy, which is set up and imagined for the current kind of system. And we're talking about a new system. Is it possible to do that as a nation, or does one have to, you know, yeah, it's a big question which nobody can answer. But those are the things that I'm thinking about when I kind of listen to you say.
Yeah, great to see you, Jim. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. And yeah, absolutely, it is a massive question, and I'm not able to answer it and do it justice, I don't think. But I would absolutely agree that, of course, we are all part of a very globalized economy. And even though I do think that certain things can be done nationally, there are limitations to the effectiveness of some of these decisions that can be taken nationally, just simply because we would remain to be exposed to exactly what you hint at there, you know, the international financial markets, for example, and things like that. So yes, absolutely. I think in the end, we will need to think much more carefully, and much more work is needed in this field to think about how can this become a more international initiative, and what sort of initiatives are needed at the international level to support exactly the types of policy options that we have just been talking about. So yeah. And not even to mention, you know, the complications that we have sort of between global north and global south, and the inequalities there, and what happens if we in the global north, you know, move to more ecologically sustainable economic systems and reduce things like fast fashion and what have you, you know. So how does that affect well-being in the global south as well? So I think these discussions are just now starting to happen. So yeah, I'm in no way sort of trying to downplay the complexity and the difficulties or challenges that all of this involves. But yeah, it's also an opportunity to yeah, do more work, I think, in this area.
Thanks. I suppose if I were just to come back, what would your one, if you could pick like one policy measure or one thing that we could do like now in a national context, and perhaps it'd be something that sets the stage for something else. What having looked at the literature, what comes out as the kind of key, yeah, maybe the key priority?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is probably where I'm quite influenced by, you know, being essentially a social policy person. And so I think my main response would be really to collectivize a lot of the essential service of the essential service economy. So yeah, so the more we can, and by that I don't necessarily just mean nationalization in the sort of old-fashioned way. I think there need to be ways for more democratic control as well over these types of services. But yeah, sort of thinking about how we can provide essential services in a more collective way, a not-for-profit way. So basically do away with all the privatized elements of things like the healthcare sector and the social care sector, And we see a movement towards that, certainly in the UK at the moment as well, and in some other countries as well. You know, the renationalisation of public transport networks, for example, and the water network would be really important as well. So yeah, so I think that is probably one of the priorities that could at least help to improve people's well-being. And then I think still, of course, acting much more forcefully on climate change. So finding the investments there. And yeah, I think these are absolute priorities on a national level. And then, yes, and then it requires thinking about how does that relate to the international level? Where are the challenges that come from exposure to financial markets? Yeah, that's a quick an attempt to answer your answer quickly.
Thank you. Any more questions? We still got about 5 minutes left. Guess if nobody else has a question, I feel like I might have one, which is around like how do you feel? Yeah, as I said before, there's a little bit of I feel like in the progressive movement, there's a little bit of the debate between the kind of MNT and how important it is. And I feel like post-growth economics comes in it kind of from a different angle to that whole question. So I was just wondering how you found that this kind of message lands in that movement, I think.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I would so the debate between Blakely and Richard Murphy, I think, was really sort of presented as a debate between let's say you could maybe say a more old-fashioned old-fashioned left-wing movement and modern monetary theory, right? So I think Richard Murphy's argument was essentially that some people on the left don't like modern monetary theory because they think it's a distraction. It doesn't really change anything, whereas I think he does argue that it does change our thinking and hence also government policy, especially because it does away with this argument of there's no money left, so we can't possibly spend more on these essential services and climate change and so on. And so I think, I think the post-growth movement is, and the class question, I think that came into it as well, sort of saying, modern monetary theory doesn't really look at class differences and so on. And I think the post-growth movement is more there sort of in line with, basically the current Green Party position, you could maybe say, where it's just more important, I think, to think about how can the economy function without growth and and seeing the positive role that modern monetary theory can play in that. Rather than think in terms of class interests in strict terms, of course, we are very concerned with inequalities. And it is useful to look at, the share of GDP that goes to labor versus capital and so on, and how much that has decreased in recent years and even decades, I guess. So that is useful, but then there are many other inequalities that are also really important, that are difficult to capture with the class term, in my view as well. And so I think these types of positions are probably more prevalent, more prominent in the post-growth movement. So, I don't know whether that's a good answer to your question, but I feel the post-growth movement is just generally speaking more open to these modern monetary theory approaches compared to some more orthodox approaches on the left, which, as we see in the Labour government, very much emphasize growth sometimes. So yeah, this is sort of, from a post-growth and well-being economy perspective, really counterproductive. And we see how the government is currently using, the current UK government is using arguments about growth to make really terrible decisions in some places. So yeah, expand airports and cut disability benefits and so on, some of which they have U-turned on. But yeah, I think that just demonstrates so much that these arguments or that sort of growth-driven policy can have quite detrimental effects from a social and environmental perspective. And yeah, hence we need to rethink, and modern monetary theory can help us that. I guess the question back would be, how do you see that?
I'm not sure we've got a lot of time for that. I think that is a very big discussion for us to have. I guess it's something you touched on, but I'm quite interested in is something which I think people have done work on, but it's maybe for another talk, is that idea between modern monetary theory and the idea that, money is not the issue, and physical, hard planetary boundaries, and how these two interact, I think quite an interesting, but there's, I think, quite a bit of work going on in that area, but that might be a discussion for another day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any
Yeah.
any other questions? For Milena, we probably got time for one quick one if anybody has a question or a comment. Doesn't look like that, and we're basically on time. So yeah, so I'm very happy to leave it there. Thank you so much, Milena, for sharing those insights, and I'm looking forward for that paper to come out. And also big thank you to Tony Robertson, who's been doing a lot of the behind the scenes organizing and for this and setting it up on some of the other webinars as well. If we have had a couple of other webinars in the series already, I put the link in the chat if you want to catch up on those. And also there will be more, but we haven't got a date for the next one yet, but it will be in the new year. And we'll share that. I think do we have a mailing list, Tony? Sorry, that people can sign up to?
We do. When people join the Zoom call, they had an option to join the mailing list. So anyone that ticked the right box will be on the mailing list. So I'll email the recording and link to the other recordings. And yeah, when we know about the future webinars, we'll get that updated as well.
Yeah, if you don't want to be on that mailing list, if you follow WEAL Scotland or the People's Health Movement in Scotland, you will find out about any of the other more webinars that are coming up. So yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you again, Milena, and we'll hopefully see you at the next webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Lucas and Tony and everyone else. It was really nice to be able to share some thoughts and get your responses. Thank you.